June 1943. New York Harbor. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and coal smoke as a convoy of ships moved slowly past the Statue of Liberty. On the deck stood thousands of German prisoners of war, their uniforms tattered, their faces hollowed by months of fighting in Africa. They clutched their duffel bags and stared at the skyline rising before them. For many, this was the first glimpse of America, and it would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew. They had been raised on propaganda. Goebbels had told them that the United States was a mongrel nation, a place of chaos and crime, jazz and chewing gum, ruled by corrupt businessmen and incapable of serious war. Their officers repeated the same message. America was weak, divided, and soft. Soldiers joked bitterly about cowboys and black music, convinced that the war would never be decided on this distant continent. But now, as Manhattan loomed on the horizon, those lies cracked. Even in wartime, the city was alive with light. Skyscrapers glowed like monuments of steel and glass. Ferries crossed the Hudson, their decks illuminated. Neon signs buzzed. Streetcars clanged along the avenues. One prisoner later recalled, "In Germany, we lived in darkness. In New York, even the night was alive." For men who had spent the past years in blackout cities where even a candle flame could draw bombs, it was almost unbearable. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, all lay in ruins, their nights broken by sirens and fire. Families lived in cellars, windows taped against shattering glass. But here, the Americans did not darken their windows. They dared to live in brightness. To many prisoners, it seemed an act of arrogance, or perhaps of unimaginable strength. The silence on deck was profound. Guards noticed that even the most talkative men stopped whispering. Some clutched the railings tighter, others crossed themselves. One American officer wrote in his diary, "For the first time, I saw doubt in their eyes. They realized their leaders had lied." When the ships docked, the prisoners were herded onto waiting trains. Their journey inland began almost immediately. Few realized that they would be scattered across more than 500 camps in nearly every state of the Union. For now, they only saw what lay outside the barred train windows. The countryside rolled past in endless variety. In New Jersey, rows of neat houses with white fences. In Pennsylvania, coal trains rumbling over bridges. In Ohio, factories with smokestacks belching, assembly lines running day and night. Some prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, marveling at the sight of cars streaming down wide highways. In Germany, petrol was rationed, civilian cars were rare, and horse-drawn carts often outnumbered trucks. Here, gasoline flowed freely, and automobiles seemed as common as bicycles. In Illinois, the train slowed through Chicago. The skyline rose, almost rivaling New York's, with Lake Michigan stretching out like an ocean. On the platforms, American families waved flags at passing troop trains, not realizing that behind these windows were German soldiers. The prisoners watched children with ice cream cones, women in colorful dresses, men in clean suits with hats tilted at jaunty angles. It was a vision of normal life that in Europe had long since disappeared. One prisoner, Friedrich Meyer, later recalled, "I pressed against the window and saw boys tossing a baseball. They laughed and shouted. I thought of my little brother in Dresden, who by then was hiding from bombers every night. I envied those boys more than anything." The farther west they traveled, the more surreal it seemed. In Kansas, they saw endless fields of wheat, golden and unscarred. In Texas, cattle ranches stretched to the horizon, dotted with windmills. In Louisiana, sugarcane swayed in the humid breeze. Everywhere there was food, abundance, and peace. For soldiers who had fought over a crust of bread in Tunisia or a tin of sardines in Sicily, This was a dream. Some prisoners muttered that it was all a trick, a stage set designed to fool them. Others whispered that America must truly be invincible. If this was the nation they were fighting, how could Germany hope to win? Arrival at the camps only deepened the shock. Many had expected conditions like those of Soviet prison camps: hunger, cold, brutality. Instead, they found barracks with beds and mattresses, canteens with hot food, even libraries. The Geneva Convention was strictly enforced. Prisoners were entitled to the same rations as American soldiers. At Camp Shanks, New York, the first stop for many, they were given soap, clean uniforms, and medical checkups. One guard joked, "We feed them better than our own folks on ration books." In the mess hall, prisoners gawked at the portions: meat, potatoes, bread, even butter. Butter which had vanished from German tables years earlier. Coffee, which in Germany had been replaced by roasted barley. Cigarettes, issued by the carton. For some, the first real shock was not the skyline of New York, but the taste of American bread, white and soft, unlike the coarse black loaves of home. Letters home were censored, but many managed to slip in subtle hints. "Do not worry," wrote one soldier to his parents. "I am in good health, and we are not starving." Another added, "Tell my sister I have eaten chocolate again." German families reading these letters in ruined cities scarcely believed them. Was it possible that their captured sons were living better than they were? The contrast gnawed at the prisoners. Some clung to loyalty, insisting that America was decadent, its wealth hollow, its people weak. But each day brought new evidence to the contrary. Guards were disciplined but not cruel. Civilians waved from passing cars. Children tossed candy over fences. And the cities they glimpsed from trains were alive with prosperity. In one vivid memory, prisoner Hans Keller described his arrival in New Orleans. The train passed through streets lined with jazz clubs, the sound of trumpets and trombones spilling out onto the sidewalks. He had been told that jazz was degenerate music, the soundtrack of decadence. But as he listened to the joyous notes, he felt his certainty crumble. If this is decadence, he thought, then perhaps decadence is stronger than discipline. Not every prisoner was convinced. In some camps, fanatical Nazis whispered that the Americans staged everything, that the abundance was fake, meant to brainwash them. They warned others not to be fooled. But the evidence was overwhelming. Even the act of seeing women free and unafraid left an impression. In Germany, women queued for hours for scraps of food, lived in fear of bombs, and worked in factories stripped of safety. In America, women wore bright dresses, strolled down streets with ice cream in hand, and laughed openly. To many German soldiers, this was the most powerful symbol of all, a society unbroken by war. One of the most striking testimonies came from Günter Greve, later famous for his affection toward the U.S. He remembered standing in front of a shop window, trying to decide whether to buy ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola with the small allowance prisoners received for labor. In the end, he chose both. For him, that moment symbolized everything: the abundance, the freedom of choice, the taste of a world beyond scarcity and fear. The journey across America planted seeds that would grow throughout their captivity. Seeds of doubt about the Reich, seeds of curiosity about democracy, seeds of admiration for a society that could produce so much, even in the midst of global war. By the time the trains reached the sprawling camps of Texas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and beyond, the prisoners had already undergone their first transformation. They had arrived as conquerors who became captives. They stepped off the trains as men who had glimpsed another future, one brighter, freer, and more abundant than they had ever imagined. Letters home were censored, but many managed to slip in subtle hints. "Do not worry," wrote one soldier to his parents. "I am in good health, and we are not starving." Another added, "Tell my sister I have eaten chocolate again." German families reading these letters in ruined cities scarcely believed them. Was it possible that their captured sons were living better than they were? The contrast gnawed at the prisoners. Some clung to loyalty, insisting that America was decadent, its wealth hollow, its people weak. But each day brought new evidence to the contrary. Guards were disciplined but not cruel. Civilians waved from passing cars. Children tossed candy over fences. And the cities they glimpsed from trains were alive with prosperity. In one vivid memory, prisoner Hans Keller described his arrival in New Orleans. The train passed through streets lined with jazz clubs, the sound of trumpets and trombones spilling out onto the sidewalks. He had been told that jazz was degenerate music, the soundtrack of decadence. But as he listened to the joyous notes, he felt his certainty crumble. If this is decadence, he thought, then perhaps decadence is stronger than discipline. Not every prisoner was convinced. In some camps, fanatical Nazis whispered that the Americans staged everything, that the abundance was fake, meant to brainwash them. They warned others not to be fooled. But the evidence was overwhelming. Even the act of seeing women free and unafraid left an impression. In Germany, women queued for hours for scraps of food, lived in fear of bombs, and worked in factories stripped of safety. In America, women wore bright dresses, strolled down streets with ice cream in hand, and laughed openly. To many German soldiers, this was the most powerful symbol of all, a society unbroken by war. One of the most striking testimonies came from Günter Greve, later famous for his affection toward the U.S. He remembered standing in front of a shop window, trying to decide whether to buy ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola with the small allowance prisoners received for labor. In the end, he chose both. For him, that moment symbolized everything: the abundance, the freedom of choice, the taste of a world beyond scarcity and fear. The journey across America planted seeds that would grow throughout their captivity. Seeds of doubt about the Reich, seeds of curiosity about democracy, seeds of admiration for a society that could produce so much, even in the midst of global war. By the time the trains reached the sprawling camps of Texas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and beyond, the prisoners had already undergone their first transformation. They had arrived as conquerors who became captives. They stepped off the trains as men who had glimpsed another future, one brighter, freer, and more abundant than they had ever imagined. When the trains pulled into the camps, scattered across the American South and Midwest, the Germans braced themselves for the worst. They expected brutality, hunger, perhaps even executions. What they found instead unsettled them even more than the dazzling lights of New York. A life behind barbed wire that in many ways seemed gentler, safer, and richer than the life their families were enduring back home. The camps were vast, often built on the edges of small towns. Wooden watchtowers rose above rows of barracks. Double lines of barbed wire enclosed everything. Yet inside, life unfolded with an order and predictability that felt almost domestic. Each prisoner had a bed with a mattress and blankets, a footlocker, and space to keep his belongings. Latrines and showers were primitive but functional. There was electricity, running water, even heating in the winter, luxuries that many German civilians no longer enjoyed. The daily rhythm was strict. Reveille sounded at 6. Prisoners filed out for roll call, then breakfast, oatmeal or pancakes, bread, coffee sweetened with real sugar. For men who had grown used to ersatz substitutes in Germany, barley coffee, saccharin tablets, bread made with sawdust filler, it was a shock. Some could not bring themselves to eat at first, convinced it was a trick, but hunger won, and soon even the most skeptical admitted that American rations were generous. After breakfast, assignments varied. Some prisoners worked inside the camp, cleaning barracks, cooking, repairing fences. Others were loaded onto trucks and driven to nearby farms or sawmills. Those who stayed behind often spent mornings in classes. Camps organized English lessons, technical training, even art workshops. By afternoon, recreation took over. Football fields, volleyball courts, and makeshift theaters echoed with laughter and song. Perhaps the most astonishing feature of camp life was the access to books. The YMCA and local libraries donated thousands of volumes in both English and German. Prisoners devoured Goethe and Schiller alongside Mark Twain and Jack London. In one camp, the library held more than 6,000 books. Reading became a lifeline, a way to escape monotony, but also a window into another culture. Many prisoners later said that the books they read in captivity changed their outlook more than any lecture or sermon. Music also flourished. Nearly every camp had at least one band, often more. At Camp Huntsville in Texas, prisoners formed a symphony orchestra with violins, trumpets, and drums scavenged from local donations. They performed Beethoven and Brahms, but also jazz and swing. In Alabama, concerts were open to civilians, and local families came to hear the enemy musicians play. One American girl recalled years later, "It was strange. They were supposed to be monsters, but they played music that made us cry." Theater thrived as well. At Camp Hereford, productions of Mozart operas drew large crowds. Prisoners built sets from scrap wood, painted backdrops, and sewed costumes from old curtains. For a few hours, the barbed wire faded, and the audience, both German and American, was transported into another world. Guards sometimes laughed and applauded louder than the prisoners themselves. Sports became another pillar of life. Soccer dominated, with tournaments drawing hundreds of spectators. But the Germans also learned baseball. Guards explained the rules, and soon Sunday games pitted German teams against American ones. Though the Germans rarely won, they relished the competition. "It was the first time I felt normal again," one prisoner wrote. "We were no longer soldiers or captives, just men chasing a ball." Inside the wire, newspapers circulated. Written and printed by prisoners, these papers included news summaries, essays, poetry, and even cartoons poking fun at camp life. Censors reviewed each issue, but generally allowed wide latitude. For many, these publications were proof that their captors did not fear their words. In a world where German soldiers had been taught that censorship was absolute, this freedom astonished them. Food remained a central obsession. Prisoners could buy extras from the canteen with small wages earned from labor. Chocolate, cigarettes, Coca-Cola. Many admitted that they ate better in captivity than as free men in Germany. Some felt guilty writing to their families, knowing that back home people starved while they tasted abundance. One wrote in his diary, "How can I tell my mother that I drink coffee every morning when she must line up for hours for a crust of bread?" The Americans insisted on discipline, but it was discipline without cruelty. Guards treated prisoners firmly but fairly. Punishments for infractions were usually loss of privileges, not beatings. Escapes were rare, and most who fled returned voluntarily, unable to survive outside. One man who slipped away in Texas walked for 3 days, only to return exhausted, saying, "In camp, I had food. Out here, I had nothing." Letters were a vital connection. Each prisoner was allowed to write home twice a month. Censors blacked out sensitive details, but the essence of camp life reached Germany. Families were astonished to hear of libraries, concerts, and full stomachs. Some refused to believe it, thinking the letters were faked. But when thousands of similar reports arrived, the truth spread. Their sons were living as human beings, not slaves. Friendships with locals developed slowly. Farmers who worked with prisoners discovered that they were not monsters, but young men like their own sons. Children learned German words, and Germans practiced English in return. In some cases, deep bonds formed. Stories circulated of American families inviting prisoners to Christmas dinner, of women baking pies and slipping them into work trucks, of children exchanging drawings through the fence. For men who had been told that Americans were savages, these gestures cut deeply. Of course, not all was idyllic. Conflicts flared between die-hard Nazis and those who simply wanted to survive. Inside many camps, a shadow hierarchy enforced loyalty to Hitler. Men suspected of defeatism were threatened, beaten, sometimes killed. But as the war dragged on and news of Germany's collapse trickled in, the grip of fanaticism weakened. By 1945, most prisoners openly admitted that the Reich was finished. Still, the memories of camp life stuck with them. For some, it was the music, the sound of jazz echoing across the barracks at night. For others, it was sport, the joy of playing soccer before a cheering crowd. For many, it was the food, the taste of white bread, butter, and coffee, luxuries unthinkable at home. But above all, it was the sense of being treated as men, not as enemies to be destroyed, but as humans with dignity. Years later, when historians interviewed former prisoners, a pattern emerged. Many said that the years behind barbed wire were paradoxically some of the safest and richest of their young lives. They learned languages, discovered literature, heard new music, made friends, and dreamed of futures beyond war. As one recalled, "I entered the camp a soldier of the Reich. I left it a student of democracy." America in wartime faced a strange paradox. Millions of young men were overseas, fighting in North Africa, in Italy, in France, in the Pacific. At home, factories roared and fields stretched heavy with wheat and cotton, but there were too few hands to gather the harvest or keep the mills running. Women filled many roles, but the labor gap was immense. Into this void stepped an unlikely workforce, German prisoners of war. By the rules of the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be required to work as long as it was not directly in the war industry. The United States seized the opportunity. Soon after arrival, German POWs were loading onto trucks every morning, bound not for battlefields, but for America's fields, forests, and workshops. Farmers in Texas were among the first to see them. Cotton fields stretched for miles, but with local boys away in the army, the crop risked rotting under the sun. When the trucks arrived, guarded by a handful of soldiers, rows of Germans filed out. They worked with surprising discipline. They bent to the cotton as if it was their own, one farmer said. By the end of the day, we were calling them our boys. The arrangement was simple. The U.S. Army contracted their labor to farmers, who paid the government. The prisoners themselves received a small credit, a few cents a day, which they could spend in the camp canteens on cigarettes, candy, or Coca-Cola. To men who had come from a land of ration cards and scarcity, the chance to buy chocolate or tobacco felt like luxury beyond imagining. In Nebraska, prisoners harvested corn. Locals watched in astonishment as the enemy carried baskets through golden fields, singing German folk songs. Children followed them, shy at first, then braver. Soon they were trading words. "Mais," said the Germans, pointing to the crop. "Corn," answered the children. Apfel, said one prisoner, holding up an apple. Apple, replied the kids. These exchanges grew into friendships. Years later, Nebraskans remembered their surprise. They were supposed to be monsters. They turned out to be farm hands with smiles. In Georgia and Alabama, prisoners picked peaches. They climbed ladders into trees heavy with fruit, filling baskets under the southern sun. Women brought jugs of sweet tea to the workers, sometimes handing cups directly to the Germans. Guards rarely interfered. The contact was inevitable, and in many places, cordial. One local girl later recalled, "We giggled because they were handsome, polite, and grateful. Our mothers scolded us, but we never forgot those days." Not all Americans welcomed the arrangement. Some asked angrily why enemy soldiers were allowed to eat meat while their own families scraped by on ration stamps. Editorials appeared in local papers. Should we reward those who tried to kill our boys? But farmers defended the program. Without the prisoners, crops would rot, sugarcane would spoil, lumber would go uncut. We couldn't have done it without them, one Texan declared. In the forests of Oregon and Washington, Germans wielded axes and saws. Logging was brutal, dangerous work, but many prisoners embraced it. The rhythm of chopping, the smell of pine, the sweat of labor gave them a sense of normalcy. An American logger remembered, "They weren't lazy. They worked hard, shoulder to shoulder with us. Sometimes you forgot they were prisoners at all." There were occasional attempts at escape. A few men slipped away from the work details, hoping to reach Mexico or Canada. Most didn't get far. One group in Arizona trekked into the desert without food or water, only to stumble back days later, dehydrated and desperate. Another in Texas reached the border, but Mexican authorities returned them. More often, prisoners who fled voluntarily came back. "In the camp, I had food and a bed," one said. "Outside, I had nothing." For many, the real escape was emotional. Working in the fields, talking with farmers, tasting fresh fruit. These were glimpses of normal life. Some prisoners found kindness unexpected. One farmer's wife baked pies and slipped slices to the men. Another gave them magazines. Children often became the boldest ambassadors. They approached without fear, offering gum or asking for songs. Germans responded by carving toys, teaching words, even sketching portraits. One striking story came from Arkansas, where a prisoner named Heinrich befriended a local boy. He carved the child a wooden horse, whittled from scrap pine. The boy treasured it for decades, keeping it on his mantle long after the war. When historians interviewed him in the 1980s, he still said, "That German was my friend. He worked on our farm, and he made me a gift. I never forgot it." Food was always at the center of memory. Germans marveled at the abundance. Even during labor, they were fed generously. Sandwiches thick with meat, fruit, sometimes cakes. For men whose families were stretching ersatz flour with sawdust back home, this abundance was unforgettable. Some felt guilty. One wrote, "I worked all day in the sun, and an American farmer's wife handed me bread and butter. How can I write this to my mother in Hamburg, where she waits hours for a crust?" The work also built respect. Farmers admired the Germans' discipline, their willingness to rise early, toil hard, and finish tasks without complaint. Germans admired American efficiency, tractors, irrigation, silos, systems that seemed far more advanced than those at home. "We saw a land that worked like a machine, but fed its people like a mother," a prisoner recalled. In some places, bonds deepened beyond the fields. Christmas of 1944 saw farmers inviting prisoners to join family dinners. Guards turned a blind eye, and men who months earlier had fought in Tunisia now sat at tables decorated with candles, sharing turkey and pie. One former prisoner remembered the moment vividly. "I thought of my mother's table, empty and cold, and I sat there in America eating warmth. I wept." Of course, not all encounters were friendly. Some locals spat or shouted insults. In Louisiana, a prisoner working on a sugarcane plantation was beaten by civilians who had lost relatives in the war. Guards intervened, but the bitterness lingered. These moments reminded the Germans that, however well treated, they were still the enemy. Yet over time, something shifted. The routine of labor, the smiles of children, the simple fairness of being paid even a token wage, all of it chipped away at the image of America painted by Nazi propaganda. Prisoners saw that democracy did not mean chaos. It meant farmers negotiating wages, guards enforcing rules without cruelty, families living in light instead of fear. By war's end, German POWs had harvested millions of tons of crops, felled thousands of acres of timber, and kept American agriculture afloat. The work had given them more than food and cigarettes. It had given them a view into the daily heart of America. Years later, many would say that it was in the fields of Texas and Nebraska, not in the battlefields of Normandy, that they truly lost faith in the Reich. Because there, with sweat on their brows and bread in their hands, they realized that the enemy they had been taught to despise was in fact a nation strong, prosperous, and strangely kind. For all the music, theater, and friendly encounters with American farmers, life in the prisoner of war camps was not free of shadows. Behind the barbed wire, a battle was fought that had nothing to do with rifles or tanks, but with ideology, fear, and loyalty. The camps contained not just ordinary soldiers who longed to go home, but also fanatical Nazis determined to enforce Hitler's will even thousands of miles from Berlin. These men, often non-commissioned officers or party loyalists, formed what prisoners later called das Lager Gestapo, the Camp Gestapo. Their purpose was simple: to maintain discipline, crush dissent, and silence anyone who doubted the Reich. They spied on conversations, held secret meetings, and threatened those who expressed sympathy toward Americans or admitted that Germany might lose the war. For frightened young conscripts, the Camp Gestapo was a continuation of the fear they had lived under at home. At first, the Americans underestimated this danger. To them, the prisoners were just men behind fences, grateful for food and shelter. But soon, reports of intimidation surfaced. Prisoners whispered to guards that they could not speak freely. Letters home were carefully worded, not just because of American censorship, but because they feared retaliation from their fellow Germans. The system of terror grew sharper as the war turned against Germany. When news of defeats in Russia, Africa, and France reached the camps, morale sagged. Many prisoners began to admit privately that the Reich was doomed, but saying so aloud was dangerous. To the fanatics, defeatism was treason. The most notorious incident occurred in Tonkawa, Oklahoma, in November 1943. Camp Tonkawa held about 3,000 German prisoners, most captured in North Africa. Among them was 17-year-old Karl Pretzel. Unlike many of his comrades, Karl openly questioned Nazi propaganda. He read American newspapers provided by the YMCA, shook his head at the headlines of German defeats, and told others that Hitler was leading Germany to ruin. To the Camp Gestapo, this was intolerable. On the night of November 4th, Karl was dragged from his barrack by a group of prisoners. Guards later testified they saw a commotion, but assumed it was horseplay. The next morning, Karl's body was found outside the wire. He had been strangled with a rope. A note pinned to his shirt read, "He betrayed Germany." The murder shocked America. Newspapers carried headlines. Nazi prisoners kill their own. Citizens who had worried about humane treatment of POWs now demanded harsher controls. The U.S. Army launched an investigation. Dozens of prisoners were questioned, and several identified as ringleaders were charged. In the end, 5 men were sentenced to death. In July 1945, they were hanged at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the only German POWs executed on U.S. soil. The Tonkawa case was not unique. Similar, though less deadly, incidents occurred in other camps. In Hereford, Texas, a prisoner who spoke too freely of Germany's likely defeat was beaten severely. In Nebraska, 2 men were hospitalized after being attacked for fraternizing with guards. In Georgia, rumors spread of secret trials held at night, where prisoners judged each other for cowardice. The Americans eventually realized they faced not just prisoners, but a hidden battlefield of ideology. They began to separate the camps. Black camps housed fanatics, often former SS or Gestapo men, who refused to renounce loyalty to Hitler. White camps contained ordinary soldiers judged to be non-political. Gray camps held those in between. This classification helped reduce violence, but the scars remained. For many prisoners, the experience of living under the shadow of the camp Gestapo was a second captivity. We were behind barbed wire, one recalled. But inside that, we were behind another wire, fear of our own comrades. Young men who might have embraced American kindness stayed silent, afraid of being labeled traitors. Some guards grew aware of the tension. They saw that prisoners fell silent when certain men entered the barracks, that laughter died and conversation stopped. An American officer later said, "You could feel it. Some of them were terrified not of us, but of each other." The problem grew acute as the war neared its end. By 1944 and 1945, the steady stream of bad news, Normandy, the collapse in France, the Red Army pushing into Poland, reached the camps. Many prisoners no longer believed in victory. Some even began to dream of staying in America after the war. But saying so openly was dangerous. One slip of the tongue could mean a beating in the night. In this atmosphere, the Americans saw an opportunity. They encouraged open discussion, knowing it would split the prisoners from the fanatics. They circulated newspapers, organized debates, and sometimes quietly supported those willing to speak out. Schools for Democracy, begun in 1944, served partly as protection. Those who attended were often transferred to safer camps away from Nazi intimidation. The struggle within the wire mirrored the struggle within Germany itself. There, too, millions remained loyal out of fear, not conviction. There, too, the Gestapo crushed dissent, while ordinary people whispered doubts in kitchens and cellars. For German soldiers in America, the camps became a microcosm of the Reich. Barbed wire, order, propaganda, and beneath it, the courage of a few to resist. The Americans learned from incidents like Tonkawa. They increased surveillance, posted guards inside barracks at night, and punished ringleaders. But they also recognized the deeper truth. The war was not just military, but ideological. By allowing books, newspapers, and debates, they gave prisoners a chance to see another way of life. That, more than fences or towers, undermined the authority of the camp Gestapo. Years later, former prisoners recalled those days with bitterness and clarity. The worst enemy was not the guard in the tower, one said, but the comrade in the next bunk who listened to every word. Another admitted, "I hated Hitler, but I did not dare say so until the war ended. Even in America, I was afraid." The legacy of the camp Gestapo left deep marks. For some, it hardened their rejection of totalitarianism. Having lived under fear in both Germany and captivity, They swore never to allow such tyranny again. For others, the memory was one of shame, that even in the land of freedom, they had been too afraid to speak. But the killings and beatings also taught the Americans a crucial lesson. Humane treatment alone was not enough. To truly win the prisoners, they had to break the grip of ideology. And so, in the final years of the war, the U.S. military launched its boldest experiment, teaching democracy to its enemies. If work in the fields gave prisoners food for the body, culture gave them food for the soul. Behind barbed wire, far from their homeland, German prisoners built a world of music, theater, art, and literature that astonished both guards and locals. For many, these activities were not just pastimes, but survival, ways to remember they were human beings, not just numbers in uniforms. Theater emerged first. In almost every camp, resourceful men scavenged wood, cloth, and paint to construct makeshift stages. At Camp Hereford in Texas, the effort grew into something extraordinary. Prisoners built a full theater hall, complete with curtains, footlights, and tiered seating. They performed Schiller and Goethe, and even operas by Mozart. Costumes were sewn from curtains and burlap sacks, wigs fashioned from rope. Audiences packed the hall, fellow prisoners, guards, sometimes even townsfolk invited to attend. One American officer described the scene. They acted with such passion that you forgot where you were. For a few hours, the war outside did not exist. For the prisoners, the plays were more than entertainment. They were affirmations of identity, proof that they were still part of a culture older and deeper than Hitler's Reich. Music soon followed. Germans had brought harmonicas, violins, even accordions with them across the Atlantic. American churches and civic groups donated instruments. At Camp Huntsville, Texas, an orchestra of 40 musicians formed. They played Beethoven, Brahms, and Bach, but they also learned American songs, Home on the Range, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, even the latest jazz tunes. To men who had been told jazz was degenerate, the discovery was electrifying. It was freedom in sound, one prisoner recalled. In Alabama, concerts were open to civilians. Families arrived with picnic baskets, sitting on blankets to listen as the enemy orchestra filled the evening air. Children clapped, soldiers tapped their boots, and for an hour or two, the line between friend and foe blurred. One young woman later remembered. We looked at them and thought, they are boys like ours, with violins instead of rifles. Choirs were even more common. Men gathered in barracks to sing folk songs from Bavaria, hymns from childhood, and new tunes learned from American hymnals. The sound carried across the wire, sometimes mingling with church bells from nearby towns. Guards said the singing gave the camps an eerie beauty. At night, you could hear German voices rising into the dark, singing of home, of mothers, of peace. Art thrived as well. Skilled prisoners painted murals inside chapels and recreation halls. At Hereford, a chapel still bears frescoes painted by POWs, saints and angels with distinctly German faces. In Minnesota, a prisoner carved intricate figures into barn beams while on a work detail. In Arkansas, others painted landscapes on scraps of canvas, capturing both the American prairies around them and the forests of memory from home. Some prisoners became portraitists, sketching guards, farmers, and their families. Many Americans kept those drawings for decades. In Kansas, a farmer's daughter recalled, "A German drew my picture when I was 12. I kept it all my life. It reminded me that even in war, kindness was possible." Writing also flourished. Camps published newspapers in German, often with names like Der Zaun, the fence, or Die Baracke, the barracks. They carried poetry, satire, short stories, and camp news. One issue from Fort Robinson included a crossword puzzle, a recipe for apple strudel, and a humorous essay titled How to Chase a Chicken in Nebraska. Though censors reviewed content, they allowed surprising freedom. Prisoners poked fun at guards, complained about bland stew, and debated philosophy. For men raised under Nazi censorship, this was shocking. It was the first time I felt I could write without fear, one prisoner said. Education became another cultural pillar. The YMCA organized classes in English, mathematics, and history. Professors from local universities volunteered to teach. Some camps ran full lecture series: American literature, constitutional law, even economics. At Camp Swift in Texas, prisoners debated the Federalist Papers. At Camp Stark in New Hampshire, they studied Shakespeare. Some earned certificates recognized after the war in Germany. Sports, too, carried cultural weight. Soccer tournaments drew huge crowds inside the wire with rivalries between Bavarians and Prussians, veterans of Africa versus Normandy. Yet Americans introduced baseball. Guards explained the rules, and soon Germans were swinging bats and shouting, "Strike!" in heavy accents. They lost often, but loved the game. It was confusing at first, a prisoner admitted, but when I hit my first home run, I felt like an American. Cultural life reached beyond the wire. Prison orchestras performed for towns, art was exhibited in local halls, and theater groups staged plays for schools. Americans who attended often left with changed perceptions. One teacher wrote, "I expected to see brutes. Instead, I saw men quoting Goethe and painting angels." The cultural explosion left lasting marks. Frescoes in Texas chapels still stand, preserved as historic landmarks. In Minnesota, barn carvings remain, weathered but visible. Old newspapers survive in archives, their jokes and poems echoing across decades. These remnants remind us that behind the wire, culture did not die. It thrived. For the prisoners, culture was resistance, not against their captors, but against despair. By singing, painting, writing, and acting, they asserted their humanity. They proved, to themselves and to their guards, that they were more than uniforms, more than enemies. They were men, heirs of centuries of art and thought, capable of creation even in captivity. Years later, many former POWs spoke of these experiences with pride. "I learned more in that camp library than in all my years at home," one said. Another recalled, "I sang in a choir that mixed hymns with jazz. It opened my heart to America." And a painter who had decorated chapel walls in Texas confessed, "I left a piece of myself there. My art outlived the war." Culture in the camps was not simply pastime. It was transformation. It bridged the gap between captor and captive, dissolved propaganda, and left behind works that endure to this day. And for the men who lived it, it was proof that even behind barbed wire, the human spirit could soar. By 1944, American authorities had begun to see the POW camps not just as places of detention, but as laboratories for the future. The war would end one day. Millions of German soldiers would return home. What kind of men should they be when they stepped off the ships? If they carried the same beliefs that had fueled Hitler's Reich, the seeds of another war might be planted. If instead they returned with a different vision of society, Germany might be reborn. Thus began one of the most ambitious and unusual experiments of the Second World War, the schools for democracy. It started quietly. YMCA volunteers and sympathetic officers noticed that many prisoners hungered for education. They devoured books, asked about politics, even debated America's Constitution. Why not formalize it? The War Department agreed. In selected camps, professors from nearby universities were invited to lecture. Libraries were expanded. Newspapers and pamphlets were distributed, not just for entertainment, but to spark discussion. At first, lectures covered safe ground: English lessons, American geography, world literature. But soon, bolder topics appeared: the Bill of Rights, the separation of powers, free elections. For men raised on Nazi indoctrination, these ideas were shocking. "You mean the people choose the leaders?" one prisoner asked in disbelief. The professor smiled. "Yes, and if the leaders fail, the people choose again." Debates became central. In Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, German prisoners gathered in barracks converted into classrooms. The topic one week: what form of government should Germany have after the war? The room divided. Hardliners shouted for discipline, unity, a strong hand. Others, emboldened by their captivity, argued for parliaments, constitutions, freedom of speech. The arguments grew heated, but the fact that they were allowed at all stunned the men. In Germany, such debates could mean prison, or worse. Here they were encouraged. In Camp Hereford, Texas, a newspaper run by prisoners began printing essays on democracy. One article compared the Federalist Papers to Goethe's philosophy. Another examined Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. For young Germans who had grown up on Hitler Youth slogans, it was as if a curtain lifted. "We discovered that ideas could fight each other without guns," one recalled. Professors from Chicago, Yale, and Princeton traveled long distances to speak. They taught economics, explaining how America's system produced abundance without tyranny. They taught history, showing how the U.S. had survived civil war and emerged stronger. They taught literature, reading Shakespeare and Whitman aloud. Prisoners listened with rapt attention, scribbling notes in borrowed pencils. For some, it was their first true education. The impact was not uniform. Fanatics scoffed, dismissing lectures as propaganda. Some walked out, but many stayed. They asked questions late into the night, argued in bunks, wrote essays by candlelight. One young soldier wrote in his diary, "I thought democracy meant weakness. Now I see it means strength, the strength to listen." The Americans understood they were not simply filling time. They were planting seeds. They distributed German-language copies of the U.S. Constitution. They encouraged prisoners to form discussion clubs. They even created a model parliament in some camps, where prisoners elected representatives to manage internal disputes. The experiment was crude, but it worked. For the first time, many Germans practiced voting without fear. Music and theater supported the lessons. A performance of Schiller's Wilhelm Tell, staged in Texas, was interpreted by many as an allegory of resistance to tyranny. Jazz concerts, once banned in Germany, became symbols of freedom. Even sports carried lessons. Soccer games where rules were respected. Disputes resolved peacefully. Fairness upheld. By 1945, as Germany collapsed, the debates grew more urgent. Prisoners asked, what should happen to Hitler? Should the army disband? How could democracy survive in a ruined land? Some argued that only America's system could save Germany. Others feared chaos. But the conversations themselves mattered more than the answers. American officers noticed changes. Prisoners who once saluted stiffly now shook hands. Men who once feared speaking openly now voiced dissent. A culture of silence was cracking. Not every camp embraced the experiment. In black camps, full of die-hard Nazis, any talk of democracy was dangerous. There, whispers of freedom could still bring a beating. But in white camps, filled with the younger or less political soldiers, the hunger for learning was intense. These camps became crucibles where Germany's future quietly shifted. After the war, the legacy became clear. Many former prisoners returned home and entered universities. Some became teachers, journalists, even politicians. They carried with them not just memories of food and music, but of debates, lectures, and the strange idea that people could govern themselves without fear. Gerhard Louet, who had studied in a Texas camp, rose to become a general in the Bundeswehr. He later said, "I learned in captivity that democracy is a military strength no less than tanks." Hans-Georg von Schulze-Gewernitz, exposed to these programs, became a professor, spreading democratic ideals in post-war Germany. Countless others, less famous, influenced their families, their students, their communities. Historians sometimes call the POW camps America's hidden universities. They were places where thousands of young Germans, captured as enemies, graduated as witnesses to freedom. One former prisoner summed it up simply, "I went to America as a soldier of Hitler. I returned as a student of Jefferson." By late 1945, the war was over. Hitler was dead, Germany in ruins, cities smoldering under Allied bombing. For the 370,000 German prisoners in America, the long-awaited moment of repatriation had finally come. But the home they returned to was not the one they had left. The process began slowly. Ships once filled with troops now carried prisoners back across the Atlantic. They boarded in New York, New Orleans, Boston, their eyes lingering on the skyscrapers one last time. Many wrote in diaries about the silence on deck. They remembered their first arrival, the shock of light, the smell of coffee, the hum of American life. Now they left with mixed emotions, relief to be going home, sorrow at leaving behind a land that had treated them with unexpected dignity. The journey itself was tense. Prisoners wondered what awaited them. Would families still be alive? Would their homes stand? Would they be branded traitors for surviving? Rumors spread of Soviet brutality, of starvation in German cities, of chaos. Some feared returning more than they had feared capture. When the ships docked in Europe, the shock was immediate. In France, in Belgium, in Germany itself, they stepped into landscapes of ruin. Train stations were shells, bridges collapsed, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Men who had just left camps with clean barracks and warm food now trudged past women, queuing for hours with ration cards, children with hollow cheeks, old men pushing carts through ruins. Letters written at the time capture the despair. One prisoner wrote, "We left the enemy in light and bread and returned to darkness and hunger." Another described the horror of Cologne. "Not a street is whole. People live in cellars, cooking grass and potato peels. Families were often gone. Some had fled east before the Soviets. Others had been killed in bombings. Reunions were heartbreaking. Mothers wept at the sight of sons in American-issued coats, carrying chocolate or cigarettes. Some resented the abundance their sons had tasted. "You ate butter while we starved," one woman accused. The guilt was real. Many former prisoners felt torn between gratitude for their survival and shame for having lived more comfortably than their families. Yet alongside the grief came something new, perspective. These men had seen another world. They had worked with American farmers, read Shakespeare, debated democracy, heard jazz. They had glimpsed abundance without dictatorship, strength without brutality. Now in the ruins of Germany, they spoke of what they had seen. Neighbors listened skeptically at first. How could it be that the enemy fed prisoners better than Germans fed their own people? How could it be that Americans allowed debates in camps while Germany silenced dissent with prisons? But the stories spread. In America, one man told his village, "I saw shelves of bread and meat. I saw newspapers that criticized leaders, and no one was arrested. I saw people live without fear." For many, these testimonies planted seeds of hope. Out of the rubble, a new Germany had to rise. What model should it follow? The old authoritarianism had led to disaster. The Soviet alternative, seen in the East, was harsh and repressive. But the stories of America offered something different. Prosperity with freedom, order with dignity. Some former prisoners played direct roles in the rebirth. Gerhard Luet, once a camp student, became a general in the Bundeswehr, shaping a military under civilian control. Hans-Georg von Schulze-Gewernitz, a prisoner who had studied democracy in lectures, became a professor, spreading these ideas in universities. Others entered politics, journalism, or education, carrying lessons from the camps into post-war society. Most were quieter witnesses, teachers who encouraged open debate in classrooms, fathers who told children that strength could coexist with kindness, farmers who remembered American tractors and adopted new methods. These subtle influences multiplied. Historians later argued that the experience of POWs in America helped prepare West Germany for democracy more than any occupation directive. But the return was not easy. Some Germans called them Armeekämpfer, America fighters, accusing them of being softened by captivity. Others envied their survival. It took years for the stigma to fade. Only later, as West Germany stabilized, did many former POWs speak openly about their gratitude. One of the most poignant stories was that of Günter Greve. After returning home, he never forgot his first taste of Coca-Cola and ice cream in captivity. Decades later, he rode an electric bicycle through American towns with a sign on the back, "USA, the country and its people. You are my first and final love." His journey symbolized the transformation of thousands, men who came as enemies and left as friends. The legacy stretched far beyond personal stories. In the early years of the Cold War, West Germany stood at a crossroads. Would it drift toward authoritarianism again, or embrace democracy? The voices of returned POWs helped tip the balance. They had seen with their own eyes that freedom worked. They had lived under guards who enforced rules but not terror. They had written newspapers that mocked authority without consequence. They had worked on farms where wages were paid fairly and dignity respected. These experiences gave credibility to the new democratic order. One historian later remarked, "The POW camps in America were silent classrooms. From them graduated a generation that helped rebuild Germany not as a Reich, but as a republic." For the United States, the experiment was also a lesson. By treating prisoners humanely, by feeding them, educating them, and exposing them to freedom, America had wielded a weapon more powerful than bombs: example. It had shown that prosperity and democracy could defeat tyranny, not just on battlefields, but in hearts and minds. As former prisoners aged, many returned to America to visit the camps where they had once been held. They walked through Texas fields now empty. They touched the murals they had painted in chapels. They stood before fences long since dismantled. Some wept. Some laughed. All remembered. In those memories lay the quiet triumph of America's policy. The barbed wire had rusted away, but the lessons endured. In the grand story of World War II, some chapters roar with gunfire: Stalingrad, D-Day, Hiroshima. Others whisper quietly, not artillery barrages, but letters home; not ruined cities, but murals painted inside chapels. The fate of 370,000 German prisoners of war in the United States is one of those quieter chapters. It rarely appears in school textbooks, yet its influence on the second half of the 20th century was profound. After their return home, many former POWs kept silent. In post-war Germany, there was shame, trauma, and the overwhelming burden of guilt. Few wanted to admit that while their families starved in the ruins, they had lived in barracks with warm food and libraries across the ocean. But in the 1950s, the first memoirs appeared in German newspapers. Authors confessed what seemed unbelievable. America had not only defeated them on the battlefield, it had conquered them with abundance, light, and humanity. One former prisoner, Wolfgang Vogel, wrote, "We went into captivity as soldiers of the Reich, but returned as men who had seen that the world could be different. Where we expected humiliation, we found respect. Where we expected hunger, we found abundance. And that was the strongest blow against our faith in Hitler." Americans who guarded the camps remembered it too. For them, the prisoners were a mirror. Young farm boys from Kansas or Alabama suddenly found themselves face to face with Afrika Korps veterans quoting Goethe and playing violins. Many guards confessed their own stereotypes collapsed. "We thought they were beasts," said one veteran. Instead, they were young men like us, just caught on the other side of the war. Traces of their presence remain. In Texas, chapels still bear frescoes, painted by German hands. In Oklahoma, rows of trees planted by POWs stand tall. In Minnesota, carvings remain on barn beams. These physical remnants are symbols that even behind barbed wire, creation was possible. The greatest legacy, however, was intangible. Former prisoners became silent ambassadors of America in post-war Germany. They told neighbors about supermarkets, free elections, newspapers without censorship, women walking unafraid at night. They spoke of lectures by professors, of camp parliaments where representatives were elected, of newspapers that poked fun at guards without fear of punishment. For Germans emerging from dictatorship and collapse, these stories sounded like a promise. Life could be different. Sociologists later noted that repatriated POWs were among the engines of West Germany's democratic transformation. They numbered in the hundreds of thousands, a critical mass of men who had personally experienced that democracy worked. When the Federal Republic of Germany was founded in 1949, this mass gave legitimacy to its new course, not because the Allies demanded it, but because they themselves had lived it. Not every story was bright. Some returned to the Soviet zone and found themselves in new camps, this time under harsher conditions. Others carried guilt for decades, ashamed that they had eaten butter while their families survived on potato peels. Yet even they admitted America had shown them an enemy impossible to hate. In later years, many ex-prisoners returned to the United States as guests. They stood in Texas fields where barbed wire once cut the sky. They visited chapels where their murals still adorned the walls. They shook hands with farmers whose land they had worked. Tears flowed freely. "I never thought I'd see you again," one Texas farmer told a former prisoner. "But I'm glad we were men, not enemies back then." American professors who had lectured in camps also remembered. One from Chicago recalled, "I knew then that these young men might one day build a new Germany. If even one carried the idea of freedom home, then it was worth it." By the late 20th century, historians began to describe the POW experience as a prime example of soft power. Victory not by bullets, but by the power of example. During the Cold War, the testimony of ex-prisoners was one reason West Germany firmly aligned with NATO and the United States. Hundreds of thousands of its citizens knew from personal experience. America was not just a conqueror, but a potential ally. One former soldier put it bluntly, "We did not lose the war at Kursk, nor in Normandy. We lost it the day we first saw the shop windows of New York." That phrase became a symbol, because in the end, the glowing lights, the taste of coffee, The music in the streets proved to be weapons as powerful as Sherman tanks or B-17 bombers. Looking back, we see the paradox clearly. America spent billions on weapons, yet its most effective weapon was something it could not conceal: its way of life, democracy, abundance, freedom. And those values reached even where propaganda insisted they could not, into the hearts of enemy soldiers. This is why the story of German POWs in America is not just a footnote to World War II. It is a lesson for the 20th century and beyond. A lesson that wars are not only won with battles, but with examples. That barbed wire can crumble not only under artillery, but under the smile of a child handing a piece of chewing gum through the fence. In their old age, many former prisoners admitted something astonishing. The years in America were the first time they truly felt free, even in captivity. And if today we ask why Germany so quickly transformed from enemy to ally, from ruins to one of the world's strongest democracies, part of the answer lies there, behind the fences of POW camps in Texas, Nebraska, and Alabama, in the stories of men who came as enemies and left as witnesses. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed my historical lecture about the life of German prisoners, subscribe to the channel and like it so that the algorithms recommend this video to more people. Please tell us, what do you think about this incredible historical experience?
Asia, left completely alone, took over South America, upgrading houses to the maximum level and growing the population to 2,000 people. But the zombies kept attacking. A crazily gigantic armada crossed the bridge toward the humans. People tried to fight back and they were even succeeding, but the zombies kept coming. The zombies did not stop, and there were so many of them that people could no longer hold out. The southern settlement was completely destroyed. The capital was also overrun by green creatures. From 700,000 coins, their economy collapsed to 200,000. The humans managed to survive, but unfortunately, most of the land became uninhabitable. Even though the number of zombies decreased, animals infected by the virus still remained. Yet the people slowly began to move beyond Australia, trying to reclaim the giant continent from the green monsters. Thank you all so much for watching. Leave your comments, don't forget to like, and thanks again. See you all next time.